Happy Tuesday, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well. So, first up, Candace Owens, and I posted this to my personal feed on Facebook. You can find, if you do a search for Candace Owens, New York Times, Ukrainian corruption, you can probably find the tweet. So, New York Times reached out to Candace Owens because comments that she'd made about corruption in Ukraine, per the New York Times reporter, matched comments we've seen from Russian state media. And I wanted to point this out because even the question, and it's not a question, the question assumes that comments she made match Russian state media, and therefore it's bad. Now, the way she responded to this, she responded back to the reporter with a link to one of New York Times' own editorial pieces on Ukraine and unyielding corruption back from 2016. And there were several others. Just by doing a random search, I found almost a half dozen New York Times articles talking about corruption, how there's still corruption, how there's corruption in the military. But corruption is now Russian propaganda. And again, I don't agree with everything that Candace Owens says, but the way she responded to this was brilliant because, again, how do you respond to a question that's not really a question? And here's the other thing. You could technically have Russia, even though it is the bad actor and shouldn't be invading Ukraine, using corruption as a way to try to justify what it's doing. So the fact that both Russia and New York Times are both pointing towards Ukrainian corruption in Ukraine doesn't necessarily mean that it's not true. And I point out to a few years ago when then Vice President Biden pressured the Ukrainian government to oust a prosecutor, it was because of allegations of corruption. So after all that, and how Biden himself got involved and strong-armed Ukraine, threatened to withhold $1 billion in aid unless they fired this prosecutor who happened to be investigating Burisma, among other things. But that's another story. Actually, we'll get to that in a bit. After all that, corruption in Ukraine is just propaganda, which I found interesting. Moving on to speaking of what happened with the Biden family and laptops. So this is the thing that kind of has freaked out a lot of folks or just been concerning. Because if you've been watching the news, you know the New York Times has come out with a piece recently essentially stating that the Biden Department of Justice and other sources have authenticated the emails which came from Hunter Biden's laptop. Now, the scary thing about this is that, here, and I kind of wrote it down. At the time, the New York Post, which was one of the first organizations to break the story, had its Twitter account frozen for a couple of weeks. The story itself was suppressed on Twitter, Facebook, etc. Like even if it was, you could not share a link to the New York Post website. You could not share the story at all without one, not being able to share the story in the first place, or two, having your own account temporarily banned. You had all of the media. The New York Times at the time said it was false. Politico published a letter stating from 50 intelligence sources stating that it was all false and Russian propaganda. There's that word again. Mainstream media said two things, and this was all what some people call it the alphabet organizations, ABC, NBC, etc. The media said either, one, it must be false because we haven't had time to authenticate it. So you haven't had time to do research, therefore it must be false. That's great. The second one was, it was obtained, the emails were obtained without consent, therefore it must be false. We can't use it. Which is, some people at the time pointed out that Trump's tax returns were obtained without consent, but those were able to be used. You have a lot of things in the past few years you could probably find that were obtained without consent. And like, for example, GiveSendGo had its site hacked, and its donor list, the people who were giving money to the trucker convoy in Canada, that was hacked. Yet the mainstream media had no problem publishing that and even reaching out to the people who gave money to get their take and ask them why they donated. That was information obtained without consent, but the media had no problem using that. So you had all this stuff, and even Biden, during one of the presidential debates, said, oh, this whole thing about the laptop and emails, absolutely false. So everyone, except for the outliers in media, said this was false. And now the New York Times is coming out and saying, year and a half, 2 years later, that, oh, yeah, we've authenticated these. Is it any wonder why, and the government and the media wonder why no one trusts them? Oh my goodness. So moving on, speaking of media, Zelensky, Ukraine, speaking of Ukraine, has made a move to ban, at the time, is at least 3 pro-Russian media outlets. Breaking points, it was somewhere around 11 outlets that Zelensky has banned. He's essentially nationalized the media under martial law. Now, this is something that the U.S. did in World War II. We essentially clamped down on the media so that we could get a unified message out. But it's interesting that because pro-Russian media, like, for example, you can be pro-U.S. and Biden not be your favorite person. You could be pro-U.S. and not like Trump. And so these media outlets, they're pro-Russian culture, but at least a few of them, according to Breaking Points, came out against the Russian invasion. But they still had all their stuff banned. So, yeah, there you go. Last up, the Ukrainian Biolabs. Now, this was a fascinating one. So, following the story, at first, if you said that there were biolabs in Ukraine, you were in denial. You were touting a conspiracy theory. And we all know that quote I've been throwing out there, that the time between conspiracy theory to reality is about 6 months. So we went from, okay, no labs at all, you're crazy, you're a conspiracy theorist. And then Undersecretary of State Nuland, when she was testifying, and Marco Rubio asked her, hey, so are there any bioweapons in Ukraine? And her response was, there are biological research facilities in Ukraine, and we are concerned that Russia may capture them and obtain whatever research they have there. Now, of course, you had 2 things. Well, the fact checker said that, well, they're not U.S.-run biolabs. Well, we never said they were run by the U.S. Now, per the U.S. government's own documents, they're partially funded by the U.S., but they're run by Ukraine. But then, after that didn't seem to work, the State Department issued a clarifying statement that, well, yeah, these are biolabs, but they're holding Soviet-era research. They're Soviet-era programs. Now, Ryan Grimm from The Hill asked Glenn Greenwald, why, okay, if it's Soviet era, okay, let's say that's true. Why is it taking 15 plus years to wind that down? Because Soviet Union stuff, that's like 80s, 90s. That's not 2015 or anything. Why are they still there? And Glenn Greenwald said, in reply, it's like, that could be, maybe it's true that it's taking time to wind them down. But here's what Glenn Greenwald said. He said, if it's Soviet-era stuff, and that's the key, Soviet-era, what is Russia? Russia was the seat of power of the Soviet Union, which means that if those biolabs contain Soviet-era technology, wouldn't it be Russia's own technology? I mean, so if it's Soviet-era stuff, it would mean that Russia would effectively be capturing its own research, essentially. But that's not what the U.S. government is saying. The U.S. government is saying that, well, we're concerned that Russia might obtain this stuff. Well, if it was really Soviet-era technology, Russia would already know what it was. So why is the U.S. government, why is the Ukrainian government so concerned that Russia might capture some of this stuff? So again, there you go. It's all propaganda. It just depends on which propaganda you want to believe, apparently. Yeah, I thought that was, it's like, okay, yeah, that's good. If it's Russian stuff anyway, why are we so concerned about it falling into Russian hands? Something to think about. All right, y'all take care. I'll see y'all later.